All right. We're back here. I think these streams on Saturdays, it's something I'll be doing regularly every Saturday morning, uh, following this book here, yeah? Mm, the Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Now, let's see. One second. We can get this book up. Today, we will be doing the Muslim world, and besides that, Russia and Japan in chapter one. So let's take a look at this here. By the way, I think my neighbor is like renovating his flat or something. I hope you guys don't hear that. If you do, let me know in the chat, and maybe I'll just record this on a different day. But yeah. So last time we read about beginning in chapter one, we read first about a little bit about Europe, why it seemed unlikely that Europe would uh, dominate the world, come to dominate the world. And then we read about Ming China. Yeah, and how Ming China was, amazingly organized, and they had a lot of these big projects like the Great Wall and so on. But ultimately, their downfall, their problem was that they turned in on themselves. Yeah, they stopped exploring the seas. They didn't want to engage militarily with other countries. And also, they didn't want to engage economically or technologically with other countries. So their economy faltered. It didn't do very well. Yeah, it faltered. And then they were just stagnant. They didn't grow. They were weak. Yeah, and so centuries later, it was very easy for the Europeans to come in and to dominate China. And today, we will start with the Muslim world, right? So we already looked at China. Now, on to the Muslim world. And Paul Kennedy, the author here, he says that obviously, when it comes to the Muslim world, first we want to look at the Ottoman Empire, yeah, the Ottoman Turks, because they were much closer to Europe. And so let's go ahead and read this highlighted portion. The Ottoman Empire, which was then in the middle stages of its expansion and, being nearer home, was correspondingly much more threatening to Christendom. Viewed from the larger historical and geographical perspective, in fact, it would be fair to claim that it was the Muslim states which formed the most rapidly expanding forces in the world in world affairs during the 16th century. Yeah, so if we're looking at the 1500s, the 16th century, we look at the Muslim world in general, they were the most rapidly expanding. They were growing the quickest. Yeah. And the Ottoman Empire then was in the middle stages of its expansion, of its growth, right? And being nearer home, being closer to home, closer to Europe, was much more of a threat to Europe. Yeah. And so he, of course, says here it was the most rapidly expanding, I mean, the Muslim states, the Muslim countries, right? Here he mentions obviously the Ottoman Turks, the Safavid dynasty in Persia. Yeah. He also mentions the various Muslim Hanates along the Silk Road, also in Africa, in India, excuse me, and the Mughal Empire. Yeah. But he goes on to say that in addition to this, these secular signs of Muslim growth, to these secular signs of Muslim growth, one must add the vast increase in numbers of the faithful in Africa and the Indies, against which the proselytization of by Christian missions paled in comparison. Okay, so to pale in comparison here, this is a good word to know. Yeah, to pale in comparison means in comparison it was very little. It didn't mean much in comparison, right? And so, what is he talking about here? He says, to these secular signs of Muslim growth. So, secular here, it means kind of like, let's say, non religious, right? So, we can look at how these states, these countries were expanding, right? So, how the Ottoman Empire was expanding, how the Mughal Empire and basically in India was expanding, yeah, how Muslim states in Africa were expanding, but also if we look, so outside of these secular, these non-religious factors, if we look at the religious factor, at the proselytization, so that's like going out and trying to convert people to Islam, yeah, it was much, much larger in the Muslim world or for Islam than it was for Christianity, right? So the Christian missions paled in comparison. They were very small. They didn't mean much in comparison to what was happening in the Muslim world. Mm, he goes on to say here, but the greatest Muslim challenge to early modern Europe lay, of course, with the Ottoman Turks, or rather with their formidable army and the finest siege train of the age. So, of course, we can talk about Africa, the Indies, and so on when it comes to the Muslim world, but the most formidable challenge, the biggest challenge, was the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks, yeah, and their strong army, their formidable army, and the siege train. So basically, their ability to lay siege, to conquer, yeah, to conquer cities. Mm. And so here he goes on to explain the Ottoman Turks, right? So they stretched from Crimea, where they overran Genoese trading posts, and the Aegean, where they dismantled, they took apart the Venetian Empire, to the Levant, which is like basically, let's say, modern day Palestine and Israel, yeah? Mm, and so on and so on, let's say. And also into Europe, right? And let's take a look at this next highlighted portion. Hungary, the great eastern bastion of Christendom in these years, could no longer hold off the superior Turkish armies and was overrun following the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the same year, coincidentally, as Babur gained the victory at Panipat, by which the Mughal Empire was established. Would all of Europe soon go the way of northern India? By 1529, with the Turks besieging Vienna, this must have appeared a distinct possibility to some. Yeah, so not only was the Ottoman Empire expanding in all of these directions, right, but they were also expanding into Europe. And so, for example, Hungary, this bastion, a bastion is like a fort, a fortress, a castle, yeah? So Hungary was like a bastion of Christendom, right? It was like this castle defending Christianity, Christian Europe from the Muslim Turks. It could no longer hold off the superior Turkish armies, yeah? The Turkish armies were better, and the Hungarians couldn't stop them anymore. And finally, Hungary was overrun, yeah? It was conquered by the Turks. Yeah, the Turks beat the Hungarians in 1526. And this coincidentally, so almost like by accident, uh, this was the same year that the Mughal Empire in northern India was established. Yeah. And so here the question he poses, the question he asks is, would all of Europe go the way of northern India? Yeah. Would Europe be conquered by the Muslims just like northern India was? And he says, by 1529, this appeared possible. Yeah, this seemed possible when the Turks were besieging Vienna, when they were trying to conquer Vienna. Yeah. And again, even as late as 1683, they were again besieging Vienna. Yeah. So they were again surrounding Vienna, Austria. Yeah. surrounding Vienna and trying to conquer it. Um, but it wasn't just the army. It wasn't just the land forces of the Ottoman Turks that was so powerful. Almost as alarming in many ways was the expansion of Ottoman naval power. So almost as alarming, almost as scary was the growth of their navy, of their sea forces. And he goes on to say, first they developed this navy to conquer Constantinople, right? But they also used them in operations in the Black Sea, in the southward push towards Syria and Egypt, to control the Aegean Islands, Rhodes and Crete and Cyprus. Yes, so uh, the naval forces were a big factor here. Also to control the North African coast. And but he writes, the Ottoman Empire was, of course, much more than a military machine. A conquering elite like the Manchus in China, the Ottomans had established a unity of official faith, culture, and language over an area greater than the Roman Empire and over vast numbers of subject peoples. Yeah, so this word vast, it's already shown up in the text multiple times, right? So vast means like great, great in number. So the Ottomans weren't just a superior military, a great military. They weren't just a military machine. Yeah, they created a unity of official faith, culture, and language over this huge empire. Right, it was greater than the Roman Empire. It was bigger than the Roman Empire, and a vast number of subjects. Yeah, a huge number of different nations and peoples. Yeah, I mean, look, a moment ago we were talking about Hungary, Crimea, uh, North Africa, right? Syria, the Levant, right? So this was a huge, giant empire with many different peoples. Uh, from the Hungarians to, I don't know, the modern day Tunisians, right? And Syrians and so on. And it ruled over all of these people, right? And he goes on to say, look, for centuries, the world of Islam had been culturally and technologically ahead of Europe. And he goes into this, they had good universities, libraries, and so on. They had a good system for recruiting Janissaries, right? This famous military unit from the Balkans. And going on, tolerance of other races had brought many a talented Greek, Jew, and Gentile into the Sultan's service. A Hungarian was Mehmet's chief guncaster in the siege of Constantinople. Under a successful leader like Suleiman I, a strong bureaucracy supervised 14 million subjects. This at a time when Spain had 5 million and England a mere 2.5 million inhabitants. Yeah. So, what was another benefit of the Ottomans? Well, obviously, if you rule such a huge empire, you can't force everyone to be Muslim and Turkish, right? So, tolerance of these other races, of Greeks, of Jews, of Gentiles. Gentiles is just a word for like non-Jew, essentially. So, different Christian groups, and so on. Tolerance of these people helped the Ottoman Turks. Yeah, so for example, uh, the the guy that conquered Constantinople, Mehmet, he hired a Hungarian whose actually his last name was Orban, by the way. If you ever read about the siege of Constantinople, so kind of funny that a guy named Orban helped the Ottoman Turks conquer Constantinople. Yeah, but a Hungarian, right? So their tolerance of other religions and nations helped them build this empire. And they had a strong bureaucracy that supervised 14 million subjects. Yeah, so the strong bureaucracy that was like looking over these 14 million people that lived in the Ottoman Empire. And this was at a time when Spain had 5 million and England had a mere only, 2.5 million inhabitants. Only 2.5 million people living there. Yeah. So we see kind of the scale of the Ottoman Empire. But the question is, why did Europe come to dominate and not the Ottoman Empire, right? So here we see, yet the Ottoman Turks too were to falter, to turn inward, and to lose the chance of world domination. So they too were to falter. So they also, let's say, fell. They also failed. They also turned inward. So instead of looking out and seeking to expand, they only looked in on themselves. Yeah. And they lost the chance of world domination. And he goes on to explain that basically the Ottoman Empire was too spread out. Yeah. And Ottoman imperialism, unlike that of the Spanish, Dutch, and English later, did not bring much in the way of economic benefit. Yeah, so they had a big empire, but they couldn't keep up economically. Mm. And why is this? He goes on to explain here in a second. Obviously, they faced different problems, right? Like they had to have an army in Central Europe. They also had to look out against Russia in Crimea. Yeah. And even in the Near East, there was no quiet flank, thanks to a disastrous religious split in the Muslim world, which occurred when the Shiite branch, based in Iraq and then in Persia, challenged the prevailing Sunni practices and teachings. So the Near East, just another way of saying the Middle East. Yeah, so basically, let's say like, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, that's like the Middle East, more or less, right? So the Near East. So even there, they didn't have a quiet flank or a quiet front. Yeah, they weren't safe in the Near East and the Middle East. Why? Because of the split between the Sunni and the Shia Muslims, right? There was the Shia or the Shiite branch based in Iraq and then in Persia, which challenged, so it went against the prevailing, the dominant Sunni practices of well, Sunni Muslims like the ones in the Ottoman Empire. And so he goes on to say basically the Ottomans had to also fight against the Shia Persians. And wherever they were, they had a challenger, essentially. The Ottomans did. Yeah. And with this array of adversaries, the Ottoman Empire would have needed remarkable leadership to have maintained its growth. But after 1566, there reigned 13 incompetent sultans in succession. Yeah, so with this array of adversaries, they had many different opponents, many different enemies. Yeah, every front. Yeah, in Europe, in the Middle East, in North Africa, everywhere they had some adversaries, some opponents. The Ottoman Empire would have needed remarkable leadership. So they would have needed really good leadership to maintain their growth. But after 1566, there reigned, so you could say there ruled, 13 incompetent sultans. So 13 sultans who weren't very good. And this was in succession. Yeah, one after the other. One bad sultan after another bad sultan after another bad one. And he says, unlike certain other systems, an idiot sultan could paralyze the Ottoman Empire in the way that a pope or Holy Roman Emperor could never do for all of Europe. Without clear directives from above, the arteries of the bureaucracy hardened, preferring conservatism to change and stifling innovation. Yeah. So this first sentence kind of reminds me of something that Warren Buffett, the great investor, says. Yeah, you want to invest in a company that an idiot could run, right? And the Ottoman Empire, according to the author, was built in such a way that they needed a good sultan. Yeah, and an idiot sultan, an idiot ruler, could paralyze their empire in a way that a pope or a Holy Roman Emperor couldn't do in Europe. Yeah, without clear directives from above, so without clear rules from the sultan, the arteries of the bureaucracy hardened. Yeah, so An artery, it's like your veins, yeah, that carry blood to your body. So the arteries hardened, they became hard, inelastic, yeah. They preferred conservatism to change, and they stifled innovation. So uh, they killed innovation, essentially, right? No one wanted to invent new things, try new things, create a new business in the Ottoman Empire, for example, right? Mm. Merchants and entrepreneurs, nearly all of whom were foreigners, who earlier had been encouraged, now found themselves subject to unpredictable taxes and outright seizures of property. Yeah. So remember, merchants, those are people who trade. Yeah. Entrepreneurs, those are people who start businesses. Yeah. So these people, let's say, in short, just business people, nearly all of whom were foreigners. So this is interesting too. Almost all of them were foreigners. They weren't, Ottoman Turks, who earlier had been encouraged, now found themselves subject to unpredictable taxes and outright seizures of property. So earlier, these business people had been encouraged by the government, but now they had unpredictable taxes. They never knew what kind of taxes they would pay. And sometimes their property would be seized, it would be taken, yeah, by the government. Um, and so he goes on to say that these taxes really depopulated towns, yeah, destroyed towns, businesses would move out. And also, there was this issue of this religious split in the Muslim world. Yeah. The fierce response to the Shia religious challenge reflected and anticipated a hardening of official attitudes toward all forms of free thought. So, this religious split between the Sunni and the Shia, it anticipated, so it came before a hardening of official attitudes toward all forms of free thought. So the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, yeah, the officials, the bureaucrats, they became suspicious. They didn't like free thought at all, right? And this kind of happened after this religious split. Economic notions remained primitive. Imports of Western wares were desired, but exports were forbidden. Yeah, so their economic notions were primitive, their ideas were very basic. They wanted imports from the West of Western goods, of Western wares, of Western products. Yeah, this was desired, they wanted it. But exports were forbidden. Yeah, it was banned. No exports. The guilds were supported in their efforts to check innovation and the rise of capitalist producers. Religious criticism of traders intensified. So, guilds, those are basically like unions of different producers. Yeah, so people who made clothes, for example, they had a guild and they were supported in their efforts to stop any kind of capitalists, anyone building a factory, for example, right? So they checked, they stopped innovation and the rise of capitalist producers, and religious criticism of traders intensified. So, kind of how we read with Ming China, they didn't really like a lot of this trading private business, yeah, from like a philosophical religious standpoint almost. And here was something similar happening in the Ottoman Empire. Um, and he goes on to list some examples of this, of how they closed themselves off to science and development. For example, in the south, the Muslim fleets were simply ordered to remain in the calmer waters of the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, thus obviating the need to construct ocean going vessels on the Portuguese model. Yeah, so while the Europeans had better ships, the Ottomans were like, let's not send our ships deep into the Indian Ocean or anything. Yeah, let's just keep them in the Red Sea, in the Persian Gulf, where the waters are calm. Yeah. And this obviated the need. This means like it went around, it got rid of, it eliminated the need to construct good, ships, good ocean-going ships, yeah, that could travel the world. Mm. And so this like cultural and technological conservatism was the main reason why the Ottomans fell. And then he goes on from the Ottomans to one of the other main Muslim empires, the Mughal Empire in India. And he says the above remarks about conservatism could be made with equal or even greater force about the Mughal Empire. So you could make the same remarks, you could say the same things about the Mughal Empire. Yeah. So what did the Mughal Empire look like? A conquering Muslim elite lay on top of a vast mass of poverty stricken peasants, chiefly adhering to Hinduism. Yeah. So you had a Muslim elite on top of a huge mass, a vast, big mass of poverty stricken peasants. So peasants are like serfs, yeah, farmers. So they were poverty stricken. They were poor. Okay, poverty is like poorness. So these peasants were very poor, and they were Hindu. Yeah, they chiefly adhered to Hinduism. That means they mainly believed in Hinduism. In the towns themselves, there were very considerable numbers of merchants, bustling markets, and an attitude towards manufacture, trade, and credit among Hindu business families, which would make them excellent examples of Weber's Protestant ethic. Yeah, so maybe you guys are familiar with Weber's Protestant work ethic. Yeah, and he says in the towns, we had a lot of merchants, a lot of traders, bustling markets. So the markets were really busy. An attitude towards manufacture, towards production, towards trade and credit among these Hindu families that, Weber would look at it and say it's just like the Protestant work ethic of England. Yeah. Mm. But there were many indigenous retarding factors in Indian life. Yeah, so there are many native indigenous. There are many factors in Indian life that retarded, that slowed down their economy, yeah, and their society. For example, the sheer rigidity of Hindu religious taboos militated against modernization. Rodents and insects could not be killed, so vast amounts of foodstuffs were lost. Social mores about handling refuse and excreta led to permanently insanitary conditions, a breeding ground for bubonic plagues. The caste system throttled initiative, instilled ritual, and restricted the market, and the influence wielded over Indian local rulers by the Brahmin priests meant that this obscurantism was effective at the highest level. All right. So, what were these retarding factors, these factors that slowed down development in Mughal India? Yeah. Well, religious taboos. Yeah. So, for example, what are the religious taboos that militated, that, let's say, slowed down modernization? You couldn't kill rodents, so those are like rats and insects. Yeah. So, they would eat your food. Okay. There were all types of social mores, so social rules about handling refuse and excreta. So let's just say waste, trash. Yeah. And so these rules led to permanently insanitary conditions. It was always dirty. Yeah. And this became a breeding ground for bubonic plague. So basically, there was trash, waste everywhere. It was always dirty, and you had different diseases spreading. The caste system throttled initiative. So it really slowed down, it really stopped people's own initiative, their own, ability to try to do something. It restricted the market, and the influence wielded over Indian local rulers by the Brahmin priests meant that this obscurantism was effective at the highest level. So local Hindu Brahmin priests, they had such an influence over the local Indian rulers that this like obscurantism, obscurantism, it's like almost like ideological ignorance. Yeah, like these local Indian rulers, they didn't want any change, essentially. And going on, in the Mughal Empire, the brilliant courts were centers of conspicuous consumption on a scale which the Sun King at Versailles would have thought excessive. Yeah, so we're all familiar with the monarchy in France and how that ended, right? Let them eat cake. So we always think that this is like excessive consumption, what was happening in the royal palaces in France. Excessive means too much, yeah? But the conspicuous consumption in Mughal India, in the courts, in the official government of Mughal India, conspicuous, by the way, means like when you do something to show off. Yeah, like conspicuous consumption. Now it's like the guy that lives in a village somewhere in Eastern Europe. Yeah, he works in Germany and he comes back in a BMW, even though he's just a construction worker, right? That's conspicuous consumption. He's consuming just to show off. He doesn't need a BMW. Any old car would work. Yeah. And so these courts, this government system in Mughal India, became a center of conspicuous consumption. Yeah, they're just consuming luxury goods to show off. And it was on a scale, it was so large that even in France, in Versailles, maybe the Sun King, yeah, would have thought this to be excessive, would have thought that this is too much. Um, and in addition to this, or related to this, they paid high taxes in the Mughal Empire, and for this colossal annual tribute, the population received next to nothing. So they paid colossal taxes. So that means really big taxes. Yeah, tribute is something you give to someone. So they paid really high taxes, and the population received next to nothing. They got almost nothing in return. Yeah, so earlier when we were reading about Ming China, at least the Chinese got canals, they got the Great Wall, they got this and that. Yeah. In Mughal India, there was no such return, right? So nothing essentially was built there for the population. So we see that both the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire, so the main centers of the Muslim world, the main potential competitors to Europe for world domination, they slowed their own growth. Yeah. And now let's move on to Japan and Russia. All right. So here, Japan and Russia. In the Far East, Japan was taking forward steps just as its large Chinese neighbor was beginning to atrophy. Geography gave a prime strategical asset to the Japanese, as it did to the British, for insularity, offering a protection from overland invasion, which China did not possess. Okay, so Japan was moving forward, was moving ahead, yeah, just as China began to atrophy. To atrophy means to shrink, yeah, so China was shrinking, they were going backwards, but Japan here was taking steps to grow. Okay. Geography gave a prime strategical asset to the Japanese. So it gave them a good advantage, as it did to the British. Yeah. Why? Because they were on an island or on islands. Yeah, just like the British were. So this gave them this insularity. They were protected from the outside world, from overland invasion. Yeah, you couldn't invade overland. And that's something that China didn't have. Right? China was conquered by the Mongols. Um, and there were also some other differences between Japan and China. Whereas China was run by a unified bureaucracy, power in Japan lay in the hands of clan-based feudal lordships, and the emperor was but a cipher. So the power in Japan was decentralized. Yeah, unlike in China where it was centralized, in Japan it was decentralized. So these feudal lords, these local rulers, yeah, they had the power, and the emperor, he was but a cipher. A cipher, I mean, for my Polish and Russian students or Russian speaking students, chiffre, chiffre, right? So he's essentially the code that uncodes, he unlocks these feudal lords. But what the author is saying here, the emperor didn't have a lot of power, and really these local feudal lords had all the power. So Japan was extremely decentralized. And the author argues this was a good period for Japan. For example, Christian missions and European wares penetrated Japanese society far more easily than they did an aloof, self contained Ming Empire. Yeah. So Ming China was aloof and self contained. So they didn't really care about other countries, other civilizations. They thought they were the best, right? They were aloof and they were self contained. They could produce everything they needed and they weren't too worried about it. But Christian missions, so missionaries, people trying to convert, I guess, Japanese people, and European wares, so those are goods, products, they penetrated Japan. Yeah, they entered Japan far more easily than China. And this lively, if turbulent scene was soon to be altered by the growing use of imported European armaments. Yeah, so European armaments, weapons, yeah, guns, and so on. So this scene, it was lively, maybe turbulent, so maybe a little chaotic. Yeah, it would soon be changed by these European weapons. And essentially, he goes on to explain how these European weapons, they consolidated power, they centralized power in Japan, right? And all power had been consolidated in the hands of Ieyasu and fellow shoguns of the Tokugawa clan. This time, the centralized military rule could not be shaken. Yeah, so essentially, the people who got the weapons first took control of Japan. Yeah, and now Japan became centralized. Okay, and the centralized rule could not be shaken. It couldn't be gotten rid of. It couldn't be eliminated. Yeah. Mm. And the shogun had abjuration of overseas expansion, indeed of virtually all contact with the outside world. So in Japan, the new centralized rulers, they made the same mistake that the Chinese made. Yeah. Instead of wanting to expand and engage with the outside world, they cut themselves off and they only focused on China. Okay. Mm. And they go on to say this imposed uniformity did not, of itself, throttle economic development, nor for that matter did it prevent outstanding artistic achievements. So to throttle, this word is coming up a second time today, yeah? To throttle means to limit, to stop. So this uniformity, forcing all of Japan to be the same, it didn't limit, it didn't stop economic growth, but it did prevent, nor did it prevent outstanding artistic achievements. So their economy was still growing. They still had art and culture. And he goes on to write, nationwide peace was good for trade. The towns and overall population were growing, and the increasing use of cash payments made merchants and bankers more important. Yeah, so finally having centralized peace in Japan, this was good for trade, it was good for towns, the population was growing. Uh, they used more cash, and this was good for business, for merchants, and for bankers. Okay. Um, but the Japanese were obviously unable to learn about and adopt new technological and industrial developments that were occurring elsewhere. So while things were going on decently okay in Japan, they couldn't adopt new technologies and new forms of business. Yeah. And this essentially became their problem. And essentially goes on to say, by the time uh, Europeans arrived in Japan in the 19th century, or the Americans arrived in Japan in the 19th century, they were so backwards. Yeah, they had so little technology, they couldn't resist. They couldn't put up a fight. So he goes on to Russia. Yeah? Russia appeared similar to Japan in certain respects, geographically far removed from the West. Yeah, so Russia was kind of like a periphery of Europe, a periphery of the West. It wasn't really in Europe. I mean, kind of, but it was kind of far away. Yeah. So they were kind of like Japan, they were far away. But the Kingdom of Muscovy was nevertheless deeply influenced by its European inheritance, not least through the Russian Orthodox Church. It was from the West, moreover, that there came the lasting solution to Russia's vulnerability to the horsemen of the Asian plains, muskets and cannon. Yeah. So the Russians or the Muscovites, yeah, the Kingdom of Muscovy, it was deeply influenced by its European inheritance. So what it inherited, what it got from Europe, not least through the Russian Orthodox Church. So not only through the Russian Orthodox Church, okay. Uh, More importantly, it received the technology from Europe, from the West, that was the solution to the Mongols, the Tatars, and all of these horsemen, yeah, people on horses of the Asian plains. Muskets and cannons. Yeah, so they received guns, rifles, and cannons. And so this ultimately was what helped Russia survive, let's say, and start conquering Siberia and large parts of Asia. Oops, let's keep on going. Here we go. He goes on to explain how they conquered, you know, large parts of Siberia. They pushed east through the Ural Mountains and so on. Despite its hard won military superiority over Mongol horsemen, there was nothing easy or inevitable about the growth of the Russian Empire. The more peoples that were conquered, the greater was the likelihood of internal dissension and revolt. Yeah. So there was nothing inevitable about the growth of the Russian Empire. So there was nothing sure, there was nothing certain about this growth. Yeah, they could grow or maybe not. Why? Because the more peoples that were conquered, the greater was the likelihood of internal dissension and revolt. Dissension is like disagreement. If you dissent, you disagree. So the more peoples they conquered, the bigger problems they could have. Yeah. Um, he also mentions other issues, yeah, like how the Tatars sacked Moscow, so how they conquered Moscow and took money and goods from it, how Poland occupied Moscow from 1608 to 1613. Um, he goes on to write a further weakness was that despite certain borrowings from the West, Russia remained technologically backward and economically underdeveloped. So, a further weakness, another weakness, was that despite certain borrowings, so certain things that they borrowed, that they took from the West, they remained technologically backward. They still were. They remained technologically backward. Yeah, they weren't advanced, right? And they were underdeveloped economically. So they didn't have a strong economy. And he says there were severe social defects, right? There were very serious social problems in Russia. The military absolutism of the Tsars, the monopoly of education in the hands of the Orthodox Church, the venality and unpredictability of the bureaucracy, and the institution of serfdom, which made agriculture feudal and static. Yeah, so uh, the Tsars ruled from the top with their military. This is the military absolutism. They had absolute power. The Orthodox Church had a monopoly on education. The bureaucracy was unpredictable. You didn't know what they would do. Yeah, you couldn't predict what they would do. And serfdom. Yeah, the idea of having serfs, of having peasants, farmers that had to listen to their lords, to the nobility. This made agriculture, this made farming feudal and static. Yeah. Mm. And he says, despite these problems, so even though they had these problems, they could still grow and they could still expand their autocratic rule. Yeah. He says here, he writes here, enough had been borrowed from Europe to give the regime the armed strength to preserve itself, while all possibility of Western social and political modernization was firmly resisted. Yeah. So essentially, what he's arguing here is that Russia, Muscovy, could grow because they received all this technology from the West, even though they didn't really get the technological or economic development themselves. Yeah. So as long as they could borrow these weapons from the West, they could preserve, they could protect themselves, and they could grow. Yeah. Even though modernization was firmly resisted, even though they, let's say, fought back against modernization, against new technology, new social forms, and so on. And that's about it for today. I see this video is about 45 minutes. After this, we have the European miracle, where he goes back to Europe and he explains why Europe advanced. But I think I'll save that for another live stream sometime next week, hopefully before Saturday. But Saturday morning, I'll do another live stream either way, continuing this book. So it'll either be on the European Miracle, I mean, next Saturday, or chapter 2. Yeah. If I can get the European Miracle done, maybe Tuesday or Wednesday, I think that would be really cool. That way we can move on to the Habsburg Empire, which will be chapter 2. Summarizing, what did we learn today? Essentially, according to the author, a big problem in all of these countries, yeah, in Ming China, in the Ottoman Empire, in the Mughal Empire, in Japan and Russia, was their excess conservatism. Yeah, they were conservative. And maybe in the beginning, they accepted technology and economic change, but as time went on, they stopped. And this became their problem. And this is a nice setup to what he's going to write here about the European miracle, which maybe I'll give you a prelude. I'll give you a little introduction to what he writes later in chapter 1, which is Europe was decentralized, and so no one could stop new technology. No one could stop new forms of economic growth. Yeah. So that's about it for today. For all my students, if you have any questions, I see there's no questions in the live chat, so feel free to write to me or ask during our lessons. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.